From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden goes to the scene of the recent devastating Maui wildfire and what to expect from the first Republican debate tonight in Milwaukee. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. The death toll from the Maui fire is up to about 115 last I saw, with hundreds of people still unaccounted for, emergency responders searching through the wreckage. The president was there on Monday. He pointed to a tree that survived the fire and said, today it's burnt, but it's still standing. Trees survive for a reason. I believe it's powerful, very powerful symbol of what we can and will do to get through this crisis. For as long as it takes, we're going to be with you. The whole country will be with you. He also said this.
It was a sunny Sunday, and lightning struck at home on a little lake. It's outside of our home, not a lake, a big pond, and hit a wire and came up underneath our home into the heating ducts, the air conditioning duct. To make a long story short, I almost lost my wife, my 67 Corvette, and my cat.
Kim, what do you make of this? The president is getting criticism. He obviously was trying to draw a connection there with the people in Maui who have been devastated by this fire, but he's getting some criticism for a bit of insensitivity there, comparing it implicitly to a home fire he had that almost damaged his Corvette.
There's a number of optical problems here that came from this trip. I mean, one, obviously, people had noted is that he basically was already on vacation and then goes off to Maui and then goes back to vacation. There's the substance of that story, which, by the way, numerous media fact checkers, he's told that story before, and there are problems with it. At one point, he actually suggested his entire house burned down. In reality, what some of these fact checkers found is that it was a kitchen fire that was put out in a pretty short period of time, did not do extensive damage to the house. But as you say, it's mostly just the inappropriate comparison here. I mean, this has been a devastating event with extraordinary loss of life, an entire town incinerated. It's going to take decades for the rebuilding, and for the president to go and suggest that this one moment where he had a kitchen fire somehow, as a result, he understands what the people of Lahaina are going through. It just, I think, really struck a poor chord. I understand what he was trying to do. It's what Biden does at times. He tries to suggest empathy by putting himself in a similar situation. But he gets himself sideways. He had prepared remarks. Those prepared remarks would have served. Instead, he went off script. And here we are again with another round of bad headlines for the White House.
But it does seem like when President Biden goes off script is when he gets into this kind of trouble. And Alicia, part of the dynamic, it seems to me, or maybe I should phrase it as a question, is he getting cover from the press when he makes these kinds of statements? If you think about another president going to the site of a flood or a hurricane and saying something like, my basement flooded, it was a very difficult time, we lost a lot of things, I think that would be at the top of all of the news stories. And yet, outside of some conservative commentators, this statement by the president is not getting a whole lot of attention.
So I think that's right. Actually, if you just look at the press and the headlines on the visit, the press generally is proclaiming it a successful visit. I'll just use a few examples from headlines. Biden visited Maui after devastating wildfires. He was met with grief over relief efforts. And the press have been very critical of the conservative press for poking at his statements and his attempts to show empathy, to Kim's point. But a lot of it is really praising Biden for his visit and trying to unify the country and demonstrating empathy. And you kind of have a split screen going on here between the conservative media, which has rightly criticized his embellishments or fabrications, and then also the more liberal media who just wants to, gloss over this, move on, and say that the president is being unfairly treated. Now, this is a bit of a no-win situation for most presidents to go to when they visit these places. If you recall, George W. Bush got a lot of grief when he flew over New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and he will probably never be forgiven for that. even though he made, I believe, about 13 more visits to New Orleans in the aftermath of the hurricane and really put a lot of resources, federal resources, into helping rebuild the city. But these visits are going to be politically explosive regardless, though I guess presidents feel an obligation to make them, even if they're not really providing or doing much. It's really the first responders who are on the ground and making the contributions. But for optics reasons, presidents feel like they have to be there, to use, Clinton's famous words, I feel your pain.
Yeah, I agree with Alicia. It does seem like a no-win situation for a president. As I recall, the reason that George W. Bush flew over New Orleans at that time was because he didn't want to take any resources, police, firefighters, so forth, away from the rescue efforts that would have had to go to a presidential visit to ensure security and so forth. So if he had decided to land Air Force One there, he would have gotten criticized for pulling first responders away from doing what they needed to do at that time. So, Kim, I understand why presidents feel the need to go to the sites of these natural disasters, but it does strike me as a little un-Republican, with a small r Republican. Why do we have a president, a chief executive officer, a chief bureaucrat of the federal government who feels the need to act as America's healer in chief and go to the sites of these disasters and express that he feels everyone's pain? I mean, I understand that the federal government has a job to do in terms of disaster response, emergency funds, and so forth, but you can do that job from Washington just as well as you can from anywhere else.
Well, they have an assisting job, to your point about republicanism with the small r. The governor of a state, the local officials where there are disasters are obviously lead. And what they can do is ask for assistance. And often the federal government will offer assistance to work in coordination with them. But indeed, kind of local disasters, unless they're taking place, it gets a little bit more complicated on national lands, really are a kind of state function. And this has grown over the years. There was a day where having the White House issue a statement of remorse or concern and offer assistance would be enough. But in a day of kind of modern travel, this has become this new sort of almost public media demand on the presidency. And I understand, like you, Kyle, why they often feel obligated to bow to that. But it almost seems like a no-win situation. What is the perfect scenario? If you fly over, you're supposedly not involved enough. If you get on the ground, you can get in the way. It might be sort of almost inspiring at some point to have a future president who just explains all this and hails the people that are doing their work, makes their assistance, but just says, I'm not going to be of use being there on site.
What about another argument that has been circulating, Alicia, which is that this wildfire could be proved to be another instance of a place where there were green renewable mandates put on electric companies, for example, and that caused them to underinvest in safety, tree trimming, grassland management, and so forth, and raise the risk of these kinds of devastating fires.
So one thing that has come out since the fire is that there was apparently some kind of trade-off between basically managing the power grid and safety and investing more into the transmission, hardening wires, burying wires, and actually investing more in green energy. In 2015, the state, like many others, set a renewable mandate, in this case, that 100% of power, electricity, must come from green energy, including solar, wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, even biofuels by 2045. And at that point, green energy only made about 20% of the power mix. And actually, a lot of that was geothermal and not the traditional solar and wind sources. So the utility, Hawaiian Electric, invested a lot on expanding its renewable power source, especially as the state lawmakers also mandated the shutdown of all coal plants by 2023. And so they had to procure other sources of energy, and that tended to be solar rooftop and subsidizing these solar rooftop panels through these net metering programs and batteries to kind of help keep the grid stable when the sun goes down, as well as wind power. Now, every dollar of capital you put in one place is a dollar of capital you don't invest in another place. And they really gave short shrift to mitigating wildfire risk. And then again, this could have included burying power lines, insulating power lines, helping manage brush, Some of that, the latter, is really the state's responsibility, but some of it, to the extent that it presents a risk to the utilities system, that's really the obligation of the utility. And so they only spent about $225,000 on actually upgrades and improvements to prevent wildfires from causing exactly what we now just saw between 2019 and 2022 on the island of Maui, while they were spending hundreds of millions of dollars procuring more renewable energy. And I think also you need to point out that the utility regulators are also somewhat culpable in this, because they sign off on rate increases, which is exactly how they fund these projects, is the ratepayers pay for it. But utility regulators kind of actually have to review the investment plans, the capital plans of these utilities. And they were pressing utility to do more on the green energy side, and they kind of ignored the wildfire risk. If they were to do both at the same time, it's say that you can't invest more in green energy while hardening your grid. Now, these are mutually exclusive, but that would have caused a huge amount of a rate shock. So you would have probably seen electric rates spike. And so I think there's been a lot of pressure, and this isn't just in Hawaii. This is actually in California. This was a similar problem with the PG&E, which filed for bankruptcy in 2019 after you had dozens of wildfires that were linked to its kind of aging and not well-maintained equipment, that they really focused more on the green energy and procuring green energy and actually hardening their grids to accept the green energy, because actually green energy, renewables, it requires a lot of investment in kind of balancing out frequencies because it's an intermittent source of generation. And so that actually takes money away from what you could be doing, again, in burying power lines and doing other kinds of things to mitigate the risk of wildfires.
But the point, Kim, is that the money for these green mandates has to come from somewhere. And progressives generally don't want it to come from ratepayers, I think, because ratepayers would get mad and they would revolt. Whenever things like carbon taxes are on the ballot and put to a popular referendum, they tend to lose pretty handily. So it's a game of putting mandates on these companies without really giving them a way to fulfill those mandates. Another one that I would point to that has made life particularly hard on Hawaii is the Jones Act. And it's been a while since I've looked at these figures, but as of a year ago, Hawaii was importing millions of barrels of Russian crude oil every year because it was impossible, cost prohibitive, because of the Jones Act, to get U.S. natural gas to the state of Hawaii. And so Hawaiian Electric was taking in this oil from Russia. And it's just a great example, Kim, of the legislatures, lawmakers, politicians love to put these mandates on. They pass a bill that says, we are going to make these private companies do X. And it turns out there are some knock-on effects when you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just so that everyone remembers, the 1920s Jones Act is something that requires that all cargo transported between the U.S. ports be on ships that are U.S. flagged and built and mostly owned and crewed by Americans. This has been a huge hardship on Hawaii, but also a number of other states in the Union. And we are finally having a discussion about rethinking that law, although I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But you are absolutely right. And you see a version of this in Washington, D.C. as well. Everyone used to understand, even a decade ago, 15 years ago, that if you wanted a comprehensive, quote, climate program for the country, it was something Congress was going to need to pass. And the last time there was a serious effort to do that was in 2010, in the early years of Obama, when the House did pass something like that. It was so unpopular, it was put down as one of the reasons that Democrats suffered that huge backlash at the polls in those midterms. And, even before that, but especially since then, what you've had is a left-wing climate activist groups and Democratic politicians that have linked arms to instead do this in more sneaky ways. You're going to impose these mandates. You're going to put it and foist it on companies to try to figure out how they're going to split the dollars in a way where they have to manage their core functions, but also comply with these mandates and try not to upset ratepayers. Or in Washington, it's the version of the EPA imposing these things, or various other departments simply running out all these mandates. And we're now getting the consequences of that. As Alicia says, money is finite. And in the face of these mandates and the potential for penalties if they don't hit these mandates, the very essential stuff that utilities are supposed to focus on, hardening their equipment, making sure their equipment is updated, going out and clearing for dead trees and brush for wildfires, that's not getting done in the face of these kind of ridiculous climate agenda mandates.